Ethan Carter had always believed that the land was the truest form of home. A decorated military veteran with a strong sense of duty, he returned to his roots after his years of service, taking charge of the century-old family farm that had once been his father's pride and joy. Nestled on acres of rolling fields and ancient orchards, the farm wasn't just a piece of property. It was a living legacy. Every weathered barn board and every furrowed line in the soil whispered memories of a time when hard work and integrity meant everything. For Ethan, the farm was his escape from the relentless pressures of city life, a place to nurture, to grow, and to heal. But just as Ethan began to breathe life back into the neglected pastures, a new enemy arrived in the form of an overzealous homeowners association, HOA. In a community where every property, no matter how rural, was subject to a strict, often ludicrous set of aesthetic and zoning rules, Ethan's rustic sanctuary was suddenly under threat. The HOA, spearheaded by a self-appointed enforcer known only as Kerren, prided itself on perfection. Kerren, a stern and merciless figure with a reputation for bullying even the most established residents, saw Ethan's natural, unrefined property as an affront to the manicured vision of the community. It began on a mild autumn morning when Ethan, tending to his prized apple orchard, noticed a sleek black envelope taped to his weathered front door. The letter was adorned with the HOA's insignia, a symbol of authority that, to Ethan, now felt more like a noose tightening around his legacy. Inside, the words were cold and uncompromising, a final warning for violating community light and landscape standards. According to Kerren's interpretation, even the gentle glow of his farmhouse porch and the natural scattering of wildflowers were deemed unacceptable in the eyes of the HOA. Ethan's pulse quickened as he read the notice. The letter was filled with legalese and arbitrary citations of obscure municipal codes that, to him, made little sense given the history and natural beauty of his land. Determined not to be bullied into submission, he recalled the many sacrifices he'd made in service of his country, and he wasn't about to let an entitled bureaucrat trample over his rights now. That afternoon, while the golden light of dusk danced over the fields, Ethan decided to confront the issue head-on. At the weekly community meeting, a formal gathering where the HOA board detailed improvements for the neighborhood, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped up. His presence was calm but resolute. Seated at a long, polished table, Kerren's steely eyes met his as she presented the case against him with rehearsed smugness. "Mr. Carter," she began in a clipped tone, "your property does not conform to the agreed community standards. We have received multiple complaints regarding the brightness of your exterior lights and the unkempt appearance of your front yard." A murmur rippled through the room. For many, Ethan's farm was a picturesque reminder of simpler times. Yet Kerren was relentless. "We must preserve the aesthetic integrity of our community. The rules apply to everyone," she stated flatly, her voice echoing in the hushed hall. Ethan's response was measured yet fierce. "I've always respected the community's wishes, Kerren," he said, his tone carrying the weight of his experiences both on and off the battlefield. "But this farm is my home, my heritage. I don't see how preserving a bit of rustic charm can harm anyone." His words struck a nerve. To him, the property was more than a collection of buildings. It was the embodiment of hard work, sacrifice, and freedom. That very night, as Ethan walked through the fields under a starlit sky, memories of his father's stories mingled with the bitter taste of betrayal. The land, which once promised hope and renewal, now seemed to be under siege by a modern-day despot. Kerren's first confrontation had set the stage, an unwanted imposition of order on something that was meant to remain free and wild. Ethan knew that this wasn't a minor misunderstanding. It was a declaration of war. As the cool night air whispered through the rustling leaves, he resolved that he would defend his home at any cost. The rules may have been written on paper, but his heart beat to the rhythm of the land, a rhythm that no amount of HOA overreach could silence. The next morning brought with it a chill that wasn't entirely due to the season. Ethan discovered, pinned to the same door as the first notice, a freshly printed envelope bearing an official fine, a staggering $750 penalty for excessive exterior lighting and noncompliance with community landscaping standards. The demand was as arbitrary as it was insulting. How could the warm glow of his farmhouse porch, a beacon of welcome in the dark, be a violation? And the wildflowers bordering the lane? They were nature's art, not a crime scene. Kerren, ever the icon of entitlement, was already waiting on the sidewalk when Ethan stepped outside. With arms crossed and an unyielding glare, she made it clear that she expected nothing less than complete submission. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone as implacable as the fine in her hand. "We cannot allow exceptions. The community standards are non-negotiable." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had spent years learning the nuances of local zoning and municipal law, a skill honed during his service in the military and later sharpened in civic life. "I've studied these codes, Kerren," he replied coolly. "There's nothing in any of them that gives you, or the HOA, the right to dictate how I run my property. My lights are safe, my landscape is natural, and my property is historic." Yet Kerren was unmoved. With a self-assured nod, she announced, "I will be filing a formal complaint with the local zoning board. I expect that by the end of the week, you'll see that your property is in clear violation." Her words, delivered with the precision of a drill sergeant, sent a ripple of tension through the small gathering of neighbors who had silently watched the exchange. By mid-morning, inspectors arrived unannounced. Clad in uniforms and armed with clipboards, they trailed Ethan around the property, taking notes, snapping photos, and probing every corner for irregularities. The air was thick with the scent of impending conflict as neighbors peered from behind curtains and partially open doors. Whispers spread quickly. This wasn't merely about a fine or a few extra dollars. It was a power play, a demonstration of control by an institution that had lost its way. Ethan, though perturbed, remained methodical. He began assembling copies of zoning regulations, historical documents about the farm's long-standing legacy, and even emails from previous board meetings that mentioned the value of heritage properties. "I'm not the one breaking the rules," he muttered to himself as he organized his files. "It's the system that's broken." Meanwhile, Kerren's smug satisfaction grew as she continued her rounds. "It's only a matter of time," she murmured to another board member, whose eyes darted uneasily between Kerren and Ethan's farm. "He'll come around once he sees that rules are not suggestions, they're mandates." Her words carried the weight of someone convinced of her own righteousness. But behind the veneer of confident authority, doubts began to bubble among some of the HOA's board members. A few recalled instances where the rules were relaxed for long-time residents or when minor infractions went unchallenged. Yet, Kerren's iron grip and willingness to enforce every detail left little room for dissent. In a community where conformity was prized above all, the fine against Ethan was a warning, a sign that deviation from the norm would not be tolerated. As the inspectors departed, leaving behind a trail of official forms and irritated murmurs, Ethan felt a steely determination harden within him. This was more than a personal dispute. It was a battle for the soul of his land and for the freedom of every resident who had ever dared to dream differently. With a deep breath of crisp morning air, he vowed that no matter how high the fine, no matter how stringent the demands, he would not yield. That evening, as twilight fell and the first stars appeared over the rolling fields, Ethan sat at his weathered wooden desk. Surrounded by documents, photographs, and a few battered law books, he began to craft his response, not just to the fine, but to the fundamental injustice of an HOA that seemed determined to strip him of his legacy. Each word he typed was a declaration. His home, his farm, and his very identity would not be sacrificed on the altar of conformity. In the days that followed, the situation took on a darker tone. Kerren's initial fine was only the beginning. Soon, mysterious violation notices began appearing on Ethan's property, each citing a different infraction. One day, it was an allegation of unauthorized use of natural light, a reference to the gentle glow of his outdoor fixtures. Another day, a claim that his barn's rustic paint was inconsistent with community standards. With each notice, the stakes escalated. The HOA was no longer content with passive intimidation. They were escalating into outright harassment. Ethan, realizing that these charges were nothing more than a smokescreen for an abuse of power, began to dig deeper. He recalled overhearing hushed conversations among some board members, whispers about donations, to the HOA fund that mysteriously led to dropped charges. Late one evening, while reviewing security footage from a newly installed camera on the barn, he caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure near the perimeter fence. A figure he suspected was not a concerned neighbor, but someone sent to create evidence of a violation. Fueled by a growing sense of injustice, Ethan started gathering proof. He meticulously documented every interaction with HOA officials. Every phone call, every letter, and every unannounced visit was recorded and cataloged. This isn't just about one farm, he confided to a trusted friend over a cup of strong coffee in the early hours. It's about exposing a corrupt system that preys on the very people it's supposed to protect. In a discreet meeting at a local diner, a longtime resident and fellow farmer, Harold Jenkins, shared stories of similar battles fought in hushed tones. "Kerren's been at this for years," Harold explained, lowering his voice. "She's made examples out of anyone who dares to have a property that doesn't fit her perfect image. I've seen records of fines that vanish into thin air once someone coughs up extra cash. There's corruption running deep, and you, Ethan, are about to shine a light on it." The more Ethan learned, the more he realized that Kerren's war was personal. Not only was she determined to force him out, but she was also using every trick in the book, false violations, threats of eviction, and even hints at seizing his property, to break his spirit. At one tense HOA board meeting, as he presented evidence of the inconsistencies in their charges, a few board members exchanged nervous glances. "I've always thought there was something off about these regulations," whispered one of them, his voice barely audible. But Kerren, ever the imperious guardian of the rules, silenced dissent with a pointed remark. "There's no room for debate when the safety and aesthetics of our community are at stake." As pressure mounted, Ethan took matters into his own hands. Late at night, armed with a camera and a notebook, he began documenting every unusual encounter on the farm. He recorded the sound of tires crunching on gravel, captured blurry images of figures lurking near his property, and even managed to record snippets of conversations that hinted at collusion among certain board members. Each piece of evidence was a brick in what he envisioned would become an airtight case against the HOA's overreach. With his evidence compiled, Ethan began planning his counterattack. He reached out to local legal aid groups and independent journalists, known for exposing corruption in municipal organizations. "If I can get the public on my side, if I can show everyone that these fines and rules are nothing more than a facade for greed and control," he mused aloud during one of his many late-night strategy sessions. Every document he gathered, every conversation recorded, was a testament to his determination to reclaim not just his property, but the right of every resident to live without arbitrary interference. As Ethan prepared for the inevitable showdown, a palpable tension settled over the community. Neighbors who had once quietly endured the HOA's draconian measures now began to murmur in support of his crusade. Behind closed doors and over backyard fences, discussions emerged about the true purpose of the HOA. Was it to protect a community or to serve the self-interest of a few? And in every whispered conversation, Ethan's name was mentioned with a mixture of admiration and hope. One cold morning, as the sky was painted in a bruised palette of early dawn, Ethan awoke to an unimaginable horror. Thick smoke curled over the horizon, and an acrid smell filled the air. Racing outside, he discovered that part of his beloved farm, the old barn and a section of the adjacent outbuildings, was engulfed in flames. His heart pounded in disbelief as he realized that this was no accident. It was a deliberate act meant to force his hand. Neighbors gathered at a safe distance, their faces etched with shock and sorrow. The fire had not only consumed decades of hard work and memories, but it had also become the ultimate symbol of the HOA's brutality. In the midst of chaos, Ethan's mind raced. The signs had been there, a series of unexplained inspections, mysterious visitors, and the relentless barrage of violation notices. Now, the culmination of their campaign was staring him in the face, reflected in the blazing inferno. Kerren was quick to arrive on the scene. Standing beside a company car emblazoned with the HOA logo, She observed the devastation with an unsettling calm. "This is necessary," she declared to a small cluster of onlookers. Her voice clipped and devoid of any real emotion. Sometimes, drastic measures are required to enforce community standards. Her statement sent shivers down Ethan's spine. It wasn't about preserving beauty. It was about instilling fear. Though grief and anger warred within him, Ethan refused to be paralyzed by despair. He immediately began coordinating with emergency responders while discreetly instructing a few trusted neighbors to safeguard any remaining evidence. "This fire isn't natural," he told them in a hushed tone, "and we're going to prove it." As firefighters battled the blaze, Ethan used his camera to capture every detail: the scorched remains of the barn, the reflective glints in Kerren's eyes, and even a glimpse of a figure in a dark hoodie skulking at the property's edge. Later that day, in a hastily arranged community meeting in the local town hall, Ethan laid out the evidence he'd gathered. With a file of photographs, recordings, and witness statements, he painted a vivid picture of a calculated assault. "This isn't about safety or aesthetics," he declared before an audience of shocked residents. "It's about power, and an abuse of it." As murmurs of disbelief spread, even some previously timid board members began to voice their concerns. "We trusted the HOA to protect our community," one neighbor said, her voice trembling. "But now it feels like we're being ruled by fear." In a dramatic turn, Ethan revealed the footage he had secretly recorded, the moment a hooded figure was seen near the barn just minutes before the fire broke out. The evidence was irrefutable, and it cast a long shadow over Kerren's authority. "I have every intention of taking this to the local authorities," he said, his eyes blazing with a mix of determination and sorrow. "This community deserves better than a tyrant in a suit." Kerren's reaction was one of thinly veiled panic. At the next HOA meeting, the air was thick with tension. While Ethan calmly presented his case, Kerren's usual confident facade began to crack. Board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flickering between Ethan's impassioned expression and Kerren's growing defensiveness. But she stubbornly refused to back down, insisting that everything was under control, and that the fire had been an unfortunate, isolated incident. Outside the meeting, however, the tide was turning. Neighbors who had long suffered in silence now found their voices. They spoke of the strange coincidences, of policies that had grown increasingly invasive, and of a community that was starting to awaken to the injustice at its core. The fire had not only burned down a section of Ethan's farm, it had ignited a spark of rebellion. As dusk settled over the smoldering remains of the barn, Ethan looked out over his land. The scars of the fire would fade, he knew, but the battle for justice had only just begun. In that quiet, sorrowful moment, he resolved to fight back harder than ever before, using every legal tool, every scrap of evidence, and every neighbor's support to turn the tide against the HOA's tyranny. Cornered and desperate, Kerren's tactics grew increasingly erratic. No longer content with quietly intimidating Ethan and the other residents, she embarked on one final, drastic maneuver. Late one foggy evening, as a chill settled over the community, Kerren made a call that would mark the turning point in this bitter conflict. She dialed the local police station, her voice trembling with feigned concern as she reported that Ethan's property was an imminent public hazard following the fire incident. According to her, the uncontrolled blaze had left behind dangerous debris, and worse yet, created a risk to nearby homes. When officers arrived on the scene, they were met by a flustered Kerren, clipboard in hand. "We have reason to believe that Mr. Carter is endangering the community by failing to secure the area properly," she insisted, her eyes darting nervously around the perimeter of the now charred outbuildings. But when one of the officers glanced at Ethan's official identification, flashlight in hand, evidence of his meticulous documentation, it soon became clear that something was amiss. The officer's skepticism was palpable. "We're here to investigate, not to be used as pawns in a personal vendetta," one officer remarked curtly, leaving Kerren sputtering in indignation. Not one to accept defeat easily, Kerren wasn't done yet. Within days, she escalated her scheme by hiring a private investigator, a shadowy figure whose methods reeked of desperation, to dig up any possible dirt on Ethan. Late one night, As Ethan reviewed his growing trove of evidence, his security monitor flashed with movement in his garage. On the grainy footage, he saw a figure creeping about the back door, rifling through his personal files and equipment. The intruder's clumsy efforts only served to confirm what Ethan had long suspected. Kerren's campaign against him was no accident. Furious, he secured a copy of the footage, knowing that it would be the final nail in her corrupt strategy. At the next HOA board meeting, now more of a public spectacle than a routine gathering, Ethan arrived armed with undeniable evidence. With a calm yet steely resolve, he played the incriminating video clip for the assembled crowd. The room fell deathly silent as the footage revealed the private investigator, unmistakably linked to Kerren's recent actions, tampering with Ethan's belongings. Gasps filled the air, and for the first time, even some of Kerren's staunch allies looked on with dismay. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan said slowly, ensuring every word landed, "this is not merely a dispute over a few rules or fines. This is an orchestrated effort to bully, intimidate, and ultimately force me out of my own home by any means necessary." His voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of raw emotion, a mixture of betrayal and defiance that resonated deeply with everyone present. Kerren, cornered by the overwhelming evidence, attempted to deflect. "These are mere isolated incidents," she argued weakly. "A few mistakes do not justify this," but her words faltered as Ethan continued. "Isolated? When one violation turns into a series of orchestrated assaults on my property, my legacy, and my very right to live freely, it's no longer a mistake, it's a conspiracy." By the end of the meeting, the room had transformed from one of tense formality to a groundswell of outrage. Neighbors, emboldened by Ethan's courage and the incontrovertible evidence, began questioning not only the legitimacy of the fines, but the very existence of an HOA that could stoop so low. In that charged moment, it became clear that Kerren's desperate moves had sealed her fate. That night, as Ethan sat in his modest study, surrounded by piles of evidence and legal documents, he allowed himself a brief moment of grim satisfaction. Kerren's final reckless gambit had backfired spectacularly, and now, armed with proof of every misdeed, he was ready to take this fight to every court, every public forum, and every heart in the community that had been silenced for far too long. The fallout was swift and uncompromising. As Ethan's evidence became the talk of the town, a groundswell of support surged through the community. Neighbors who had once been intimidated into silence now found their voices, rallying behind Ethan as he exposed the systematic abuses of the HOA. In emergency town hall meetings and through social media, the story spread like wildfire. An entitled board led by Kerren had not only imposed draconian rules, but had also stooped to arson and clandestine sabotage in a bid to force a man from his ancestral home. Under mounting public pressure, the board was forced to call an emergency vote. In a dramatic session filled with raw emotion and fervent declarations of community justice, the residents voted overwhelmingly to remove Kerren from her post. The very same board members who had once tacitly supported her were now forced to acknowledge her abuse of power. "We have failed to serve you," one disillusioned member admitted in a tearful statement, "and today we stand corrected." Kerren's attempts to cling to control crumbled before the united front of a community determined to reclaim its dignity. The local authorities, spurred by the overwhelming evidence and mounting public outcry, opened a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. What began as a personal vendetta had evolved into a full-scale inquiry into corruption, misappropriation of funds, and the misuse of municipal power. Lawsuits were swiftly filed, not only on behalf of Ethan, but as a class action representing every resident who had been victimized by the arbitrary and oppressive regulations. In a matter of weeks, the once feared HOA was exposed as nothing more than a front for extortion and greed. Kerren was forced to resign amid scandal and public humiliation. At her final press conference, a disjointed, stuttering affair filled with half-hearted denials, she could only offer feeble excuses for her actions. The community's verdict was clear. Her time had ended, and with it, the reign of terror that had long overshadowed the neighborhood. Ethan, though still reeling from the personal losses inflicted upon his beloved farm, found solace in the victory of justice. With Kerren's departure, the oppressive rules were swiftly dismantled, replaced by fairer regulations that respected both the heritage and the individuality of each property owner. Neighbors gathered in the now vacant community center to celebrate their reclaimed autonomy, and amid laughter, tears, and shared stories of past grievances, a new sense of unity blossomed. As the legal battles wound down and the HOA's corrupt practices were laid bare in public records, Ethan took a quiet moment to reflect on the journey. The fire that had nearly destroyed his home had ignited a far greater change, a movement that would forever alter how community governance was perceived. The scars on his property would heal, but the triumph of standing up against injustice would remain a testament to the resilience of a man who loved his land more than anything. In the end, as the community looked forward to a future free from tyranny, Ethan simply sat on his rebuilt porch, a warm cup of coffee in hand, and allowed himself a small, bittersweet smile. The battle had been long and painful, but the victory was unmistakable. The corrupt had fallen, and the spirit of the land, of freedom, of heritage, of hard-won justice, was alive and burning brighter than ever. In the weeks following Kerren's dramatic exit, the full extent of the HOA's malfeasance came under legal scrutiny. Independent audits revealed that the association's funds had been misdirected for personal gain, and several board members found themselves entangled in criminal investigations for their role in facilitating the abuse of power. The local government, spurred by mounting evidence, initiated a series of lawsuits against the HOA, accusing it of illegally enforcing regulations that had no statutory basis. Ethan was invited to speak at public hearings, where he presented his meticulously compiled documentation. His clear-eyed account of every wrongful fine, every unexplained visit, and every act of intimidation resonated with citizens who had grown tired of arbitrary rulemaking. The community rallied behind him, and the class action lawsuit grew as more homeowners came forward to share their own experiences of overreach and injustice. Within a month, the court imposed severe fines on the HOA, and a judge ordered the association to dissolve its current management structure. New leadership was mandated, one that would operate transparently and with accountability. The legal proceedings became a watershed moment for the community, a stern reminder that no organization, however cloaked in authority, was above the law. For Ethan, this legal victory was more than a personal triumph. It was the culmination of a relentless fight for justice, a fight that had united an entire community and exposed the rot at the heart of an institution meant to protect, not oppress. His final power move was a legacy of accountability, ensuring that such abuses could never again take root. As the HOA's legal woes unfolded, Kerren's personal world began to crumble. Public opinion turned swiftly against her as media outlets and local blogs chronicled every scandalous detail of her tenure. No longer the untouchable enforcer of community standards, she found herself isolated. Former allies distanced themselves, and even those who had once admired her unwavering discipline now whispered criticisms behind closed doors. Her reputation, once bolstered by an aura of authority, was now in tatters. Neighbors recalled past instances of petty cruelty and unyielding arrogance, that suddenly seemed to confirm the narrative of a tyrant brought low by her own hubris. Rumors swirled. Her personal finances were in disarray, and her family life, already strained by her obsessive need for control, was falling apart. Even her longtime partner, exhausted by the endless battles and constant scrutiny, began to question whether loyalty to someone so blinded by power was worth the cost. One day, as Kerren attempted to rebrand herself in the public eye, emerging in a hastily arranged interview with a local news outlet, her carefully rehearsed lines crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. Photographs, video footage, and first-hand testimonies painted a picture of a woman driven by ego and greed rather than any genuine concern for the community. Her public apology, when it came, was curt and insincere, a mere formality in a narrative already written by the people she had wronged. In the end, Kerren was forced to leave not only her post, but also the community she had once ruled with an iron fist. Stripped of her power and dignity, she vanished from the spotlight, her name now synonymous with entitlement and injustice. For many in the neighborhood, her downfall was a moment of poetic justice, a reminder that even the most imperious figures cannot escape the consequences of their actions. Months later, the neighborhood had transformed. The scars of conflict were slowly healing as new leadership, born of community consensus, set out to rebuild a fairer, more inclusive environment. Ethan's farm, though forever marked by the flames of betrayal, stood as a symbol of resilience and renewal. Neighbors gathered for a modest celebration on the newly restored grounds, sharing stories of struggle and triumph, and, with a touch of humor, joking about the absurdity of the past. One crisp evening, as Ethan sat on his rebuilt porch surveying the tranquil fields, a familiar knock echoed at his door. It was a neighbor, smiling wryly while holding a handmade HOA violation notice for an outrageously trivial reason. For excessive charm, the note read in bold, playful lettering. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "They really did try," he murmured, the words a quiet mic drop that resonated with every heart in the community. In that final moment, as dusk settled over the peaceful landscape, Ethan reflected on the journey. What had begun as an isolated act of defiance had grown into a battle for justice, a battle that had reclaimed not only his home, but the very soul of the community. The era of tyrannical overreach was over, and while the memories of those dark days might never fully fade, they had given birth to a new legacy, one of unity, resilience, and the unyielding power of standing up for what is right. The camera panned slowly away from Ethan's smiling face, capturing the vibrant community behind him. A community that had once been divided, now united by a shared victory. As the screen faded to black, one message remained crystal clear. When ordinary people dare to challenge injustice, even the most entitled of tyrants will eventually fall.